I was born with the devil in me. That was my excuse. What is yours? You clicked this video because you wanted to see the chute, the vats, and the bodies. You wanted the 27. So tell me, who is the real monster? The man who built the house, or the millions of you who are still trying to peek through the keyhole a century later? I want to tell you something before we go any further. I was undone after everything by $500. Not a brilliant detective, not forensic science. A jailhouse outlaw named Marion Hedgepeth, who had nothing but time and a very accurate memory for money owed. That is the machinery behind the myth. Not genius, not the devil, a man too arrogant to pay a debt. But here's what I want you to hold on to right now. Before we reach that part of the story, there were 3 children. A 15-year-old named Alice, an 11-year-old named Nellie, an 8-year-old named Howard. I am going to tell you about all of them, but not yet. First, you need to understand who I was before you can understand what I did. I was 11 years old the first time I stood in front of a human skeleton. I had not chosen to be there. A group of boys from my school had decided to cure me of what they called my odd, shy demeanor. They did this by dragging me into a local doctor's office and forcing me to touch it. They thought it would break me. For approximately 30 seconds, they were right, and then something shifted. I stopped seeing a skeleton. I started seeing a system, skin, tissue, fat, temporary, coverings over an elegant machine, something to be understood. And if necessary, removed. I went home that evening, and I was not afraid of anything anymore. That is how I have always told that story, whether the shift was quite so clean, quite so sudden. I honestly could not say I was 11 years old. Children construct themselves as they go. I simply constructed more deliberately than most. I want you to sit with that image. An 11-year-old boy in rural New Hampshire, 1872, standing in a doctor's office while other children stare at him, watching his face change, or watching him decide what face to show, because that is where the story actually begins. Not in Chicago, not in 1893. Right there. My name was Herman Webster Mudgett. I was born May 16th, 1861, in Gilmanton, New Hampshire. A Methodist family, landowners. My father, Levi, was a disciplinarian. My mother, Theodate, was devout. She prayed where other women might have intervened. When reporters came to interview the family and neighbors after my arrest in 1894, not one of them had an unkind word to say about my parents. My mother told them, "Some boys like to torment kittens, and sometimes they are very cruel to them." But Herman was too tender-hearted for anything like that. That is what my mother said. What my peers said was different. They described a boy who tracked woodland animals to perform what he called surgery on them, starting with reptiles, moving up to rabbits, then dogs. Both things can be true simultaneously. That is the first thing I need you to understand about me. Here is the second. I was always watching while other children played. I was cataloging. While other students studied, I was calculating. Most people move through the world and never notice the gaps in it, the places where a confident man could simply walk through. I noticed every single one. I graduated from Gilmanton Academy with honors at 16. I married Clara Lovering at 17. We had a child. And then I went to the University of Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery, and something accelerated. My fellow students would later say that I seemed to enjoy dissection to a degree that left even other medical students uncomfortable. My landlady discovered this firsthand when she noticed a smell emanating from beneath my bed. She reached under with a broom. What she swept out gave her nightmares for the rest of her life. I told her it was for homework. She accepted this. Now, before you laugh at her for accepting it, I want you to ask yourself something. If a calm, well-dressed medical student with excellent references looked you in the eye and said that, would you push back? Would you specifically? Most people would not. Most people never did. That is not a character flaw in them. That is just how I operated. Michigan also taught me something more valuable than anatomy. Life insurance companies trusted doctors. If a physician certified a body disfigured, burned, chemically altered, the company paid without question. The verification relied entirely on the attending physician. I was the attending physician. I looked at this the way an engineer looks at a structural gap. There was inefficiency in the system. I was suited to close it. I found it somewhat remarkable, frankly, that no one else had arrived at the same conclusion. The mechanism was not complicated. It required only a medical degree, a cadaver, and the willingness to look at what everyone else had decided not to look at. The mechanism worked as follows. Obtain a cadaver. Disfigure it beyond easy identification. Place it in a context that explained the disfigurement, a laboratory fire, an accident. File the claim. Collect. I began refining this model before I graduated in 1884. After Michigan, I moved through New York, racked up debts, disappeared in the night, abandoned Clara and my child. I told her I had suffered amnesia in a train crash, that my memory was permanently altered. Harper's Magazine wrote of me years later, he could not simply desert his family. He must erect a complicated structure of improbable lies to explain matters. I always thought that line showed a kind of admiration, even if they did not intend it. In 1886, I arrived in Chicago and became Dr. H. Holmes. I want you to keep something in mind as I tell you what happened next. I had not killed anyone yet. Everything I have just described, the fraud, the cadavers, the abandoned wife, that was the ordinary part of my life. The ordinary part. I went to work at a pharmacy in Englewood, owned by a woman named Elizabeth Holton. I was charming, educated, credentialed. She needed help. I provided it. Shortly after, Mrs. Holton disappeared. I told people she had sold me the business and moved away. She was never seen again. I want to be precise here. I will not tell you what I cannot confirm. I will only tell you that a widow in a city growing too fast for anyone to pay close attention is a particular kind of vulnerability. Chicago in 1886 was extraordinary. Every block had a building going up, and a dozen men willing to extend credit to a well-dressed physician with excellent references. By 1889, I had acquired a lot at 63rd and Wallace Streets. I designed the building myself, 3 stories. And here is something I want you to hold in your mind, a specific detail that the newspapers never quite knew what to do with. In the spring of 1893, before anyone suspected me of anything worse than credit fraud, the Chicago Tribune published an article about my building. The headline read, "Hid in Secret Rooms, Where Dealers Discover Their Missing Furniture." I had been defaulting on furniture loans and hiding the pieces behind walls I had sealed shut. Creditors came looking. They found some of their goods stacked in concealed rooms between floors and ceilings. They did not find the 3 decomposing bodies that were, in all likelihood, already in the building. The Tribune wrote a story about the furniture. Nobody wrote a story about anything else. Do you understand what I am telling you? Creditors walked through my building, looking in hidden rooms, and they found furniture. That is what Chicago in 1893 looked like from the inside. Now, I need to tell you about what I built. But I need you to understand something first. What I built was not designed for spectacle. It was designed for function, and the function is what should concern you. The newspapers gave my building names after I was arrested. The hanging secret chamber, the room of 3 corpses, the death shaft. The New York World published a diagram in 1895 and labeled the rooms for their readers, labeled them like exhibits in a museum. None of those names came from me. None of them came from the police investigation. They came from a reporter with a diagram and a deadline. I tell you this not to minimize what was in the building. I tell you this because the true inventory is considerably more disturbing than anything a journalist invented, precisely because it is so deliberate. I employed multiple contractors during construction, fired each of them before they completed their sections, refused payment. You would assume this was to keep the building's layout secret. That is partially correct, but there was another reason. I was committing fraud with the contractors themselves. Harper's Magazine later described the system this way: that he would borrow enough money to buy a lot of land, borrow on the lot to repay the original loan, build in high frenetic fashion, discharging workmen wrathfully, threatening suit against subcontractors, always stalling the payroll. As soon as the roof was on, order huge quantities of furniture on credit, sell the furniture to pay off the clamoring workmen and the loan on the lot. By the time the furniture company got to repossessing its property, the furniture was gone, and so was Holmes. Every contractor, every creditor, every investor. A transaction. The building was, at its core, an extension of the same logic. What the building actually contained: 51 doors cut at odd angles, stairways ending at ceilings, hallways that doubled back, rooms with gas lines I controlled from a single valve in my bedroom, iron-lined walls designed to muffle sound, a chute from the upper floors directly to the basement, and in the basement 2 surgical tables, pits of quicklime, vats of corrosive acid. A furnace I had acquired on credit through a shell company I called the Warner Glass Bending Company. I told the supplier it was for bending glass. When police searched the furnace in 1895, they found bone fragments, a woman's gold watch chain, hair. Now, here is the question I want you sitting with as I tell you about the people who came into that building. You have heard the word practical several times in this video. I want you to ask yourself what kind of mind looks at the problem of a human body and thinks practical. What is the shape of that? Because I want you to have the answer before I tell you about Julia. Julia Cunner arrived in my building in 1891. Her husband, Ned, managed the pharmacy on the ground floor. The family lived in the building. Within a month, Julia and I were involved. I want to be precise about the timeline here, because the timeline is what matters. Ned found out, filed for divorce, left Julia and their daughter Pearl behind. Pearl was 6 years old. There was an unwanted pregnancy. Julia had become a liability. On Christmas Eve of 1891, Julia and Pearl visited some neighbors on the 3rd floor. Those neighbors were the last people to ever see them alive. When investigators descended on the building in 1895, they found the chute from the upper floor to the basement. In the basement, they found a partial skeleton. Forensic analysis suggested it belonged to a child. Pearl was 6 years old. In my confession, I admitted to killing Julia. I described it as an accident during an abortion I performed. I mentioned Julia. I never mentioned Pearl, not once. I want you to hold that the absence of her name in my confession, as I tell you about Emmeline. Emmeline Sigrand was my stenographer in 1892. She believed I intended to marry her. I had built an airtight room on the 2nd floor. I told her it was a safe place for storing papers. Once she was inside, I locked the door. I controlled the gas from my bedroom. I later described this room in my confession as the Asphyxiation Chamber, as if naming it calmly in a document made it something other than what it was. I sold her skeleton to a medical college, $25 to $50 per skeleton. That was the going rate at the time. I want you to stop for a moment. I need you to actually hear this next part. I did not merely kill people. I liquidated them. Insurance policy, personal savings. Physical remains. Every body, an asset. Every death. A transaction that closed? A closed loop? Most people hear that and feel revulsion. I understand that, but I want you to notice something. You live inside systems that operate on exactly the same logic. The ledger does not care about the name and the entry. It only cares whether the column balances. I simply never pretended otherwise. Now, you are probably thinking about the building, about what kind of person designs that system. I want you to think about something harder. I was charming. People liked me immediately. Julia trusted me. Emmeline trusted me. The next woman who came into my life trusted me enough to sign over $60,000 of Texas real estate before she disappeared. Her name was Minnie Williams. Her sister Nanny came to visit in July of 1893. When investigators searched the building 2 years later, they found Nanny's garter buckle inside one of the furnaces. Neither woman's body was ever found, and now, the 3 children I told you about at the beginning. Benjamin Petezel was my business associate, a partner in my fraud operations. In September 1894, I used chloroform to kill him in a rented room in Philadelphia. I staged an explosion, filed the insurance claim, somewhere between $7,000 and $10,000, roughly $380,000 in your money. But here is the part that should stay with you. After Benjamin's death, I went to his wife Carrie. I told her Benjamin was alive, hiding from authorities, moving around so he would not get caught. She needed to play along. She believed me, because it was not entirely out of character for the life they had been living together. I separated the children from their mother. I told her I would keep them safe on Benjamin's behalf, and then I moved them: Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Canada, New York, 6 cities. Several months, at multiple points, I had the 2 groups, the mother in one building, the children in another, staying just streets apart from each other. Neither group knew. I want you to sit with that image for a moment. Carrie Petezel in one building, her children in another building 2 streets away. all of them waiting for a man who was already dead, and me somewhere between them, managing the distance. Detective Frank Gayer of the Philadelphia Police followed my trail through hotel registers, landlord accounts, railway records, city by city. On July 15th, 1895, he found Alice and Nellie buried beneath a cellar at 16 St. Vincent Street in Toronto. Alice was 15, Nellie was 11. There were no visible injuries on them. A coroner's report determined I had locked them inside a large trunk and filled it with gas from a lamp valve. Howard was 8. His remains, teeth, charred bone fragments, were recovered from a stove in a cottage I had rented in Indianapolis. 3 children, 3 cities, 1 detective who would not stop walking. This is the shape of what I actually was, not 200 victims, not the myth. 3 children, named, recovered, specific, and Pearl, whose name I never wrote in my confession, who was 6 years old, whose partial skeleton was found in my basement, and who I decided, somehow, did not merit a mention. I want you to carry her name through the rest of this. People who study me now reach for clinical language. Power assertive killer, narcissistic personality, compartmentalization, antisocial traits. These are accurate descriptions of a symptom. They do not explain the mechanism. Here is the mechanism. I looked at human beings and saw transactions. Every relationship was a ledger. What they had, what I needed, what it would cost to close the account. My violence was not driven by compulsion. It was not sexual in its primary expression. It was not rage. It was financial. And here is what that means practically, because I think you need to feel it, not just understand it. On the train back to Philadelphia after my arrest, in custody, with evidence gathered across 4 states and 2 countries, facing a murder charge for at least 4 people, I offered one of my guards $500 to let me hypnotize him. He declined. I want you to understand what that tells you. Not that I was desperate, not that I was unraveling. It tells you that I was still running the calculation, still looking for the gap in the system, still, even then, looking at a human being and asking, what is the transaction? Even on that train, even with everything already lost. That is not a devil. That is something considerably colder than a devil. Marion Hedgepeth wrote a letter to the Philadelphia Chief of Police in 1894. I had met him in July of that year when I was briefly jailed in St. Louis on a horse theft charge. I shared my plan with him, the Petezel insurance scheme, and promised him $500 for the name of a reliable lawyer. The scheme worked. The money came in, and I simply did not pay him. I did not think he would act on it. That was, perhaps, my only genuine miscalculation. I had assessed him as a man who understood the terms of silence. I was wrong. $500. Think about that for a moment. Not the building, not the years of fraud across 5 states, not the bodies. It was not the bodies that caught me. It was a debt. Hedgepeth had nothing but time and a grudge. Fidelity Mutual hired the Pinkerton agency. I was arrested November 17th, 1894, in Boston, preparing to leave the country with Georgiana Yoke, my 4th wife or 3rd, depending on your counting method. The initial charge was horse theft. Within weeks, it was something considerably larger. My trial for the murder of Benjamin Petezel began October 28th, 1895. in Philadelphia. I chose to represent myself. I want you to contemplate what this decision tells you. At the time I made this choice, I had already written and published an autobiography in which I confessed to 27 murders. 27 murders, published, while I was on trial for murder. Some of those 27 people were subsequently found to be alive, which tells you what my confessions were designed to do. They were commercial products. I sold the Hearst confession for $7,500, but I had still published a document describing 27 killings, and then sat down in that courtroom and attempted to convince a jury that I was not guilty of this one specific killing. The forensic evidence was overwhelming. Patrick Quinlan, my building's janitor, testified. Ned Cunner provided information about Julia and Pearl. Detective Gayer's paper trail through 6 cities was documented in meticulous detail. I represented myself better than most lawyers would have. I want you to understand that clearly. I exposed inconsistencies in the testimony. I asked for scientific analyses I was certain could not be performed. I remained calm. I was convicted November 2nd, 1895. The jury took approximately 2 hours and 20 minutes. I had thought they would need longer. And afterward, in jailhouse interviews, I increased my confession from 27 murders to 130, then to over 200. The number grew with the audience. That is what I need you to understand about the 200. It was a performance, like everything else. On May 7th, 1896, I was marched to the scaffold at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia. I was 34 years old. I told the executioner, "Take your time, old man. Do not bungle it." My formal last statement denied the Petezel murders. I claimed responsibility only for 2 women. Deaths during criminal operations. I said, I declared myself not guilty of the rest. The drop fell at 10:12 in the morning. My neck did not snap. I died of strangulation over 15 to 20 minutes. I had specified that my coffin be encased in cement and buried 10 feet deep in an unmarked grave at Holy Cross Cemetery in Yedden, Pennsylvania. I told people I feared body snatchers. I understood better than most what 4 extra feet of earth would mean. In 2017, anthropologists from the University of Pennsylvania came for me. The first coffin they opened was empty, a decoy. I want you to imagine what that moment was like. Months of preparation, a documentary crew, academic credentials, opening a coffin in the ground and finding nothing. The real coffin was nearby, sealed inside a larger cement structure, flooded with water. When they opened it, my clothes were perfectly preserved. My mustache was still attached to my skull. They confirmed my identity. I had not escaped to South America. I had not continued as Jack the Ripper. I had not faked my death. I was simply finally, completely dead. But inside my shoes, they found the lifts I had worn every day of my adult life. I was 5 feet and 3 inches tall. I had presented myself as 5 feet 8 for 30 years. Every biography, every newspaper portrait, every woman who trusted me, every creditor who shook my hand, every investigator who interviewed me, none of them knew. Even my height was a performance. So you wanted the murder castle. You wanted the chutes and the acid vats and a devil who could not help himself. Because that story lets you close this video with clean hands. Here's what you actually got. A farm boy who understood that cities reward confidence and punish the people who ask too many questions. A doctor who looked at human beings and calculated transactions. A man who moved 3 children across 6 cities over several months while their mother waited 2 streets away, and who managed that entire operation without once losing his composure. A man who wore shoe lifts for 30 years because even his physical body was something to be managed and presented. And the children, Alice, Nellie, Howard, they thought I was protecting them. They thought I was protecting them. That is not a devil. That is a neighbor. That is a doctor. That is someone who shook your hand firmly, looked you in the eye, and made you feel, somehow, that you were in good hands. You watched the whole video. I know you did. You are still here. The building is a post office now. People buy stamps there. They do not think of Pearl. She was 6 years old. She trusted someone she should not have trusted. And nobody wrote her name in the confession. I want you to be the person who remembers it. 3 children, 3 cities. 1 detective who would not stop walking. Subscribe to Shadow West, because some things should not be forgotten.